Hi, everybody. QGD Master Dennis Monokroussos here for ChessLecture.com. Today, we're going to take a look at a game played in an online event. It's a Chinese tournament, but of course, everything is virtual nowadays, thanks to the wonderful coronavirus. And by wonderful, I mean miserable, but hey, that's where we are right now. So this was played in the Hainan Danzhou tournament. So a lot of the top Chinese players are participating, and it's a mix of Chinese and foreign players. It's also characteristic of online events that they feature rather speedy time controls, where nowadays what seems to pass for a classical time control is 15 minutes plus 10 seconds increment, as opposed to all the just pure blitz and even bullet events that are going on. So this was played between two of China's best, I guess at the moment, the two best Chinese players, Ding Liren, who is, of course, number 3 in the world, I think, still at this point, and Wang, who is also very, very strong. So Ding Liren had white, and let's jump into this. This is a very theoretical game we're going to take a look at. And well, the game is interesting. It's actually kind of short in terms of what's original to it. So it's a nice game, but it's more of an excuse for us to look at some theory. Okay, so here we go. Bishop to e7 is a well-known finesse to stop white from playing a particular line of the exchange, Queen's Gambit. So I think I've discussed this before, but let's say knight f6, takes. Of course, there's also knight takes d5, which is a semi-targe, but that's its own story. So bishop g5, c6, e3, bishop d7, bishop d3, castles, queen c2, knight b to d7. And here the point of 3 bishop to e7 is that white does not have the knight g to e2 line there. Here, of course, he has it and can play it, in addition to playing knight f3, which is a more classical approach that often goes with a minority attack. But knight g to e2, and the idea here is to build white castles kingside, goes f3, knight g3 at some point, not necessarily right away because the bishop on g5 might be stranded. But the general idea is to go knight g3, maybe put the rook on d1 and play for e4 and aim to just push black off the board with a general kingside advance. And this is something I've covered before, and it's an important line. Certainly it's not just winning automatically. It's not so powerful a plan that black has no resources against it, but it is a dangerous line and one that a lot of players would prefer to avoid. So that's what Wang does with bishop to e7. And the point is that there's no real way for white to get that set up. So let's say he takes and takes. Okay, what do you do? If you go bishop to f4, it's playable. It's often played, in fact, but the bishop's obviously not going to g5 in that case. If you play e3, well, then your bishop is also not going to g5. If you play knight f3, your knight's not going to e2. You could try queen to c2 as a waiting move, but if black plays c6, for example, then that same kind of pseudo-zugzwang is in effect, where white, if he wants to make some useful move, is going to have to do something that prevents that bishop g5, e3, bishop d3, knight e2 setup. So that's the idea of bishop to e7. All right, white played knight f3, knight f6, bishop f4. Castles, a3. And the position we get in the game more often comes with white starting with e3, but in this game it doesn't really make a difference. So black played c5, take, and e3. And this is what would, again, with white starting with e3, black playing c5, white still makes the exchange, and then plays a3. So same thing. All right, knight c6, queen c2, queen a5, rook d1, and here black has a choice. Well, not just a choice between legal moves, but there are two common moves here. So there's rook to d8, and there's rook to e8. Rook to e8 is the more popular move, and it's what was played. But rook to d8 is also reasonably popular. White goes knight to d2, and then black chooses between d4 and d takes e4. And I think in both cases, white has a plus. dc is an attempt to be very solid, and it is solid, but white has a small but I would say enduring advantage in that case, while d4 is much more exciting and entertaining. It's most likely going to end up as a sacrifice. So you get this, bishop b4, takes, and then knight to d2. So white's up a piece for just one pawn. Black does get quite a lot of compensation with e5 or queen to a5. But, a piece is a piece, and the burden is on black to prove that the compensation is sufficient. So that's black's alternative to rook e8. But rook to e8 is the major move here at the moment. So knight to d2, getting out of the way, and of course aiming to play knight to b3. When I say getting out of the way, I mean clearing the way before black's center pawns start rolling. So e5, bishop g5, and now a move that I think Karpov was the first person to play, knight to d4. So he famously used this, I believe it was in the 78 World Championship match with Korchnoi. And that game he ended up losing, I believe, but a few years ago, this line got rediscovered, and no doubt, or probably thanks to computers, a whole host of new ideas have emerged for black that have made this line not only playable, but extremely popular and trendy. So it's worth taking a look at this variation and getting some sense of what in the world's going on here. All right, so let's continue. Queen to b1, bishop f5, and bishop to d3. That's why white puts the queen on b1 rather than, let's say, c1. So blocks this line. Okay, takes, and now knight to e4, just to make the board as confusing looking as possible. So white's got potential captures all over the place, and we're going to look at most of them. So I think ed is probably just not so good, but all the other captures, knight d takes e4, knight c takes e4, c takes d5, and knight takes d5 are all playable and interesting. And if you play this with black, you got to know something about all of them. So it's a fun line for black, but you got to do some homework. All right, so let's take a quick look at the options that weren't played in the game. So if knight d takes e4, go de, and now white plays queen to d2. So it doesn't play queen e4 or anything like that. It just drops the queen back. The knight on d4 is attacked. Knight takes e4 is a threat. b4 may be a threat. So black has to play knight e6, attacking white's bishop. Now I would say knight e4 is probably the best move. Queen d2, rook d2, f5, forcing knight c5, f3, and white's a pawn up. So you might think, well, this has to be good for him. I mean, it's an endgame. Black has no real threats. White's king's not in any danger. Why isn't this just good for white? And the answer is that, well, white's bishop is kind of ineffective. The pawn on c4 is a little bit loose, and there are also some ideas with e4 and knight to d3. So in this position, okay, rook a to c8, castles, and there's a game Karyak and Nakamura played in Zagreb in 2019, and there he went for the immediate e4 and drew. I'm not sure that it's the best, so I think just knight to e6, which was played in, of course, a correspondence game, is simpler, and that game was quickly drawn. So bishop h4, rook c4, there you go. Black has recovered his pawn. Bishop g3, knight f8, defending the e5 pawn. Rook to d5, f4, bishop e1, fe3, bishop c3, and now e4. So white will regain his pawn sooner or later, but the material is limited. White's rooks are not going to, let's say, get to the 7th rank, and it's a draw. Well, it was drawn here, and the position is quite drawish as well. So knight d takes e4 is entirely playable, but it looks like black's got that figured out according to current theory. Okay, white can also take with the c knight and now play queen e4. Okay, so what does black do about his missing pawn in this case? Not to mention the threat of b4, well, just goes queen to b6. So ed is not really a threat because ed, of course, and white's losing the queen. So what does white do here? Well, b4 anyway. Bishop